Grace stood at the altar, her hands trembling inside Damon. She had dreamed of this moment for years, believing she was about to begin her forever. The hall was quiet, filled with family and friends waiting for vows to be spoken. But instead of words of love, Damon suddenly pushed her hands away. The sound of gasps echoed through the room. Grace's heart dropped as she looked at him, confused and terrified. Damon straightened his shoulders, his voice cold and firm. He announced to everyone that Evelyn, Grace's younger sister, would be his bride instead. For a moment, Grace couldn't move. She stared at him, her breath caught in her chest, unable to understand what she had just heard. Then he went further, telling the crowd that Evelyn was carrying his child and that he couldn't turn his back on his real family. Grace's eyes darted to her sister, who sat in the front row, visibly pregnant. Evelyn looked away, her hands resting on her stomach, her face pale with shame, but not enough to stop her from staying seated while Damon spoke. The room grew heavy with whispers. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, unsure where to look. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered cruelly about Grace being discarded on the very day she was supposed to be celebrated. Her body felt like stone, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Damon's words sliced through her like knives, each one reminding her that the man she trusted had chosen betrayal over love. She wanted to scream, to ask why, but her voice refused to rise. The white dress that once felt like a dream now felt like a costume. The flowers, the music, the decorations, all of it had turned into a cruel stage for her heartbreak. Damon stood there with a smug expression, as if he expected people to understand, even respect, his choice. Grace turned her head toward Evelyn again, searching for some sign of regret, but all she saw was silence. Her own sister had taken everything from her and now sat quietly, as though she had a right to what belonged to Grace. With her chest aching, Grace stepped back from the altar. The world around her blurred as tears filled her eyes. Every step she took down the aisle felt like walking through fire, her pride dragging behind her like a shattered veil. And as she reached the door, she realized this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning of a battle she never asked for but could no longer avoid. Grace burst through the church doors, her veil sliding off as she stumbled outside. The cool air hit her face, but it didn't stop the burning in her chest. Tears blurred her vision, and her steps felt heavy, as though her body was fighting against her own will to move forward. She reached the edge of the steps and clutched the railing, trying to catch her breath, but nothing could steady the storm inside her. Her parents rushed after her. Her mother's hands tried to hold her shoulders, but Grace shook her head. She didn't want comfort that felt divided. She could see it in her parents' eyes, love torn in two directions. Her mother's voice wavered as she begged her to stay calm, while her father looked down, unable to meet her gaze. They stood between two daughters, and Grace felt the sharp sting of knowing she was no longer the one they would protect first. Inside the hall, voices carried through the open door. She heard Damon speaking as if his decision had been noble, as if abandoning her was an act of duty. He told the crowd he had no choice, that responsibility came before promises. His tone was strong, even proud, as though he believed his betrayal was a sacrifice worth respect. Those words reached Grace like stones, striking her heart over and over. She turned her head and caught sight of Evelyn through the doorway. Her sister sat silently, one hand resting over the curve of her stomach, eyes lowered to the floor. She refused to look at Grace, as if hiding behind her condition could shield her from the shame of what she had done. That silence cut deeper than any confession could. Evelyn's refusal to meet her gaze told Grace everything she needed to know. This was not a mistake, not a moment of weakness, but a choice made long before today. Grace's chest tightened as she realized she had lost more than a partner. She had lost the sister she grew up with, the one she trusted to guard her secrets and share her joys. The person who should have stood beside her was now the one who took everything away. That truth pressed down on her shoulders until she could barely breathe. Relatives whispered from behind, unsure which side to take. Some reached for her, offering empty words of pity, while others stared at Evelyn, their faces drawn with judgment. But it didn't matter. Grace felt completely alone. No one in that crowd understood the depth of what had just been stolen from her. Her dress, her flowers, the guests, all of it had become meaningless. The life she imagined had collapsed in one brutal moment, and the pieces were scattered so far she couldn't imagine ever putting them together again. She could not stay another second in that place, where every corner carried laughter that wasn't meant for her. Without another word, Grace pulled herself free from her mother's hands and walked away from the church. She didn't know where her steps would lead, but she knew she could not look back. The life she thought she had was gone, and the people she thought she could count on had already chosen their side. Grace stayed inside her room for days, the curtains closed, the world outside shut away. The wedding dress lay crumpled in the corner, too painful to touch, yet too heavy a reminder to throw out. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still see Damon's face and Evelyn's silence. The memory clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. The whispers began almost immediately. Relatives who had witnessed the scene repeated it to others, until it spread beyond family. Neighbors offered fake sympathy at the door, but Grace could hear the gossip behind their words. She was no longer the bride, she was the sister who had been cast aside. Shame followed her like a mark she couldn't wash off. Her mother knocked on her door one evening, carrying a tray of food Grace didn't want. She set it down and sat at the edge of the bed. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. She told Grace to forgive Evelyn, not for Damon, not for what had been taken, but for the baby's sake. She said the child was innocent, and holding on to anger would only deepen the wound. Grace listened, but her chest tightened. The words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they revealed where her mother's heart had shifted. Evelyn's unborn child had already taken center stage, while Grace's pain was treated as a storm that would eventually pass. Her feelings became something to be managed, while Evelyn's condition was something to be protected. Her father tried to avoid the subject, retreating behind silence, but even that silence spoke loudly. When Evelyn visited the house, he looked after her carefully, making sure she was comfortable, while barely glancing at Grace. Watching her parents hover around Evelyn left Grace feeling like she had been erased from her own family. Nights were the hardest. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment that led to this. She wondered how long Damon and Evelyn had been together, how many lies were told to her face, and how blind she had been to miss the signs. The more she thought, the more she realized that the betrayal wasn't sudden. It had been building quietly, while she planned her future with trust and excitement. Each morning, she tried to gather the strength to step outside her room, but the moment she heard hushed voices in the living room, she pulled back. Conversations stopped whenever she entered. She knew her name carried weight now, not for respect, but for scandal. The humiliation grew heavier every time she caught someone's eyes dropping or their voices lowering. Grace's world became smaller each day. Her home no longer felt safe. Her family no longer felt whole. The bond she once believed unbreakable had been severed. In their eyes, Evelyn's pregnancy outweighed her pain, and Damon's betrayal was treated as a mistake they had no power to change. Grace realized she was standing alone, not just against her fiancé and her sister, but against the very people who were supposed to hold her when she fell. It was weeks before Grace finally gathered the courage to face the truth head-on. The whispers she had tried to ignore became harder to push aside. Every conversation seemed to carry small pieces of a puzzle she hadn't wanted to see. One evening, while clearing old boxes of wedding decorations she never got to use, she overheard two relatives talking in hushed tones in the next room. Their words froze her where she stood. Damon and Evelyn had been meeting long before the wedding day. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't sudden. It had been going on for months. The realization hit like a knife. Grace felt her knees weaken, and she gripped the edge of the box for support. She thought of all the nights Damon claimed he was working late, all the excuses about last-minute meetings or sudden errands. Every time, she had believed him. Trust had been her anchor, and now she saw it had only been a mask he wore to keep her blind. Pieces started to connect. She remembered how Evelyn would disappear during family gathering, how Damon seemed distracted whenever her sister was in the room. Grace had brushed it off, telling herself she was imagining things. Now she saw that she had been looking straight at the truth, and choosing to deny it because the thought of betrayal seemed impossible. The weight of it sank deeper when she realized her wedding planning had been nothing but a cover for them. While she was choosing flowers, Evelyn had been meeting Damon in secret. While she was writing vows, he was building promises with someone else. Grace felt as though her entire engagement had been staged, a performance Damon carried out to keep her occupied while he prepared a different future with her sister. She couldn't stop the images flooding her mind. Evelyn smiling at Damon when no one was looking, Damon whispering to her behind closed doors. They had been living a double life in plain sight, and Grace had been the only one kept in the dark. The humiliation of being deceived wasn't just about the wedding day anymore. It stretched back into every memory she thought was safe. One night, alone in her room, Grace sat on the floor with her head resting against the wall. She didn't cry this time. The tears had dried, replaced by something colder. Her hands clenched into fists as she whispered to herself that she would no longer be the victim in their story. They had chosen betrayal, and in doing so, they had freed her from illusion. She told herself she would rise, even if it meant doing it alone. If Damon thought she would break, and if Evelyn believed her silence meant weakness, they were both wrong. Grace promised in her heart that one day, they would see the strength of the woman they discarded. Not through screams, not through revenge shouted in anger, but through a life lived beyond their reach. That vow settled into her soul like steel. It was the first time since the wedding that Grace felt steady. Betrayal had taken everything she thought she had, but it had also given her clarity. Damon and Evelyn might have built their secret on lies, but she would build her future on truth. And she would never let them forget that they underestimated her. Grace knew she couldn't keep living under the same roof where whispers lingered in every corner, and her pain was treated like an inconvenience. One morning, she packed a small suitcase and left quietly, without announcing her plan. She didn't tell her parents where she was going, only that she needed space. They tried to convince her to stay, but their words felt empty, and she refused to keep shrinking in a house where Evelyn's comfort mattered more than her own healing. She found herself in a new city a few hours away, one where no one knew her story. The streets felt strange at first, but that strangeness carried relief. No eyes followed her, no voices lowered when she walked past. For the first time since the wedding, she breathed without feeling the weight of judgment. Grace accepted a position at a healthcare nonprofit, a job she found by chance while scrolling through opportunities late at night. At first, she thought it would just be a distraction, a way to keep her mind from circling back to the betrayal. But as the days passed, she realized the work gave her something her family hadn't: purpose. The office was small, but the tasks were meaningful. She helped organize programs for patients who couldn't afford treatment, assisted families navigating difficult diagnoses, and coordinated with volunteers. Her dedication didn't go unnoticed. Colleagues quickly saw her as dependable, someone who not only did her job but carried it with heart. Unlike at home, no one looked at her with pity. They saw her for who she was, not for what she had lost. Every kind word from a coworker, every nod of respect from her supervisor, began to rebuild the parts of her that had been torn apart. Slowly, Grace felt herself growing stronger, not from revenge or bitterness, but from proving that she could stand on her own. Evenings were no longer filled with tears. Instead, she stayed late at the office, organizing projects and sharing ideas. When she walked home through the quiet streets, she felt tired but steady. Her apartment was modest, yet it was hers, her own space untouched by betrayal or judgment. In that city, Grace wasn't the abandoned bride or the betrayed sister. She was simply Grace, a woman carving out her place. The shadows of Damon and Evelyn still followed her, but they grew fainter with time. Each achievement at work dimmed the noise of the past, replacing it with something brighter. One day, while leading a team meeting, Grace realized she hadn't thought about the wedding for hours. She had been too busy, too focused, too alive in her own path. It struck her that healing didn't come from forgetting, but from building something so strong that the past could no longer dictate the future. For the first time in months, Grace felt free. Free from her family's shadow, free from Damon's lies, free from Evelyn's betrayal. She had walked away, and in doing so, she had found the strength they never believed she had. Time moved forward, though the ache of what happened never fully disappeared. Grace chose silence as her shield. She cut every line of contact with Evelyn and Damon, blocking any letters or messages that tried to slip through. She didn't attend family gatherings where she knew they would appear, and when relatives asked her to make peace, she simply walked away. She had no space in her heart for people who had stolen so much from her. In her new city, Grace's life grew steadier. Her work at the nonprofit expanded, and with every paycheck she put money aside. She lived simply, refusing to waste her earnings on things that didn't matter. Instead, she studied how to make her savings grow. She read books, spoke with financial advisors, and took small steps that turned into big ones. The first property she bought was a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. Owning it gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in years. She later invested in another unit, then another, renting them out carefully. Her portfolio grew slowly, but Grace never rushed. She made choices with patience, knowing her stability was being built one careful step at a time. Her independence gave her strength. Every time she signed a new contract or paid off another loan, she felt a little more free from the weight of the past. Damon's name no longer mattered, and Evelyn's shadow grew smaller with every success Grace carved for herself. When people asked about her personal life, Grace smiled politely but never gave much away. She didn't seek comfort in quick romances or temporary affection. The betrayal had left a scar too deep for her to pretend it didn't exist. She promised herself she would never settle for someone unworthy of her trust again. For now, her own growth was enough. Evenings were often quiet, spent with books, financial planning, or journaling. At times the old wound reopened, and memories returned when she least expected them. She could still see Damon's cold announcement at the altar or Evelyn's eyes turned to the ground. The sting never fully left, but instead of breaking her, it fueled her resolve. Pain became her reminder not to rely on anyone else to build her happiness. Grace's circle remained small but loyal. She built friendships with co-workers and neighbors who respected her for her kindness and discipline. None of them knew the full story of her past, only that she was a woman who carried herself with quiet strength. That was enough. Years passed, and Grace realized she had created something Damon and Evelyn could never touch, a life built on her own terms. Her independence wasn't loud or showy. It was steady, like bricks stacked carefully until they formed an unshakable wall. The betrayal had once been her downfall, but now it was her foundation. She no longer lived as the broken bride they left behind. She lived as a woman who rose from ruins and built herself anew. 3 years slipped by, and Grace had settled into the rhythm of her life. She didn't seek out news of Damon or Evelyn, but stories found their way to her through relatives who couldn't resist sharing. At first, she ignored them, but one conversation changed everything. Over dinner, a cousin casually mentioned that Damon's business had collapsed. He was drowning in debt, borrowing money from anyone willing to lend, and people were turning him away. Grace listened without a word, her face calm, but inside she felt the faint stir of something she hadn't allowed herself in years: vindication. The man who once stood tall in arrogance was now scrambling to keep himself afloat. Soon after, another piece of news followed. Evelyn was struggling, overwhelmed by the weight of raising a child without stability. Damon's failures had left them with almost nothing, and Evelyn, once so proud, was now reaching out to people she had once ignored. Grace heard from her mother that Evelyn had even asked about her, hoping she might help. The request hit Grace like a bitter echo of the past. Help, from the very sister who had taken everything from her? The memory of being pushed aside at the altar flashed through her mind. Damon's voice declaring Evelyn his real family, her parents' helpless faces, and the sting of humiliation that had followed. Her parents came to her not long after, sitting across from her in her apartment. Their words were soft, but their message was clear. "She's still your sister," her mother said, eyes pleading. "Blood is blood. You can't turn your back forever." Her father nodded, adding that the child was innocent and needed stability. Grace's jaw tightened. She wanted to shout, to ask where this compassion had been when she was the one bleeding inside. Where were these words when she was locked in her room, alone with her pain? No one had said then, "She's still your daughter." No one had begged Evelyn to think of her sister's broken heart. The double standard burned inside her, and her anger resurfaced like fire through dry wood. She kept her voice steady, refusing to let her parents see the storm inside. She reminded them, without raising her tone, that she had been abandoned too. Damon had made his choice, Evelyn had stood by it, and everyone else had let it happen. Now, when the consequences had arrived, they wanted Grace to clean the mess. Her mother's eyes welled with tears, her father sighed heavily, but Grace stood her ground. The years of silence had built her strength. She wasn't the broken bride anymore. She was a woman who had rebuilt herself piece by piece. And while Evelyn might have been her sister by blood, that bond had been shattered the moment she stepped into Grace's place at the altar. Grace felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a hard truth. Choices carried weight, and Damon and Evelyn were finally living with theirs. For her, the anger was no longer weakness, it was armor, and she would not let them pierce it again. One rainy evening, Grace heard a knock on her door. At first, she thought it was a neighbor, but when she opened it, she froze. Evelyn stood there, soaked from the weather, a small child clutching her hand. Her sister's eyes were swollen, her clothes worn, and her shoulders slumped under the weight of desperation. Evelyn's voice trembled as she spoke. She said Damon had left her when the debts piled too high, walking away without looking back. The money was gone, the promises had crumbled, and she was left with nothing but a child to raise. Her words spilled out quickly, desperate and uneven, as though admitting them was both a release and a shame. Grace leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed. The sight of her sister like this stirred something deep inside her, but not the sympathy Evelyn expected. Instead, it was a sharp reminder of the night she was pushed aside, humiliated in front of everyone, while Evelyn sat silently with Damon at her side. Evelyn begged for help, her voice breaking. She said she had nowhere to go, no one willing to take her in. Her friends had turned away, their parents had grown tired of carrying her burdens, and Damon had vanished without a trace. Her last hope was the sister she had betrayed. Grace looked her straight in the eyes. Her voice was steady, quiet, but it cut through the air like glass. "Did you ever once feel guilty," she asked, "when you took everything from me?" The question hung between them, heavy and unshakable. Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came at first. Her shoulders trembled, and then she broke down, tears spilling down her face as her child pressed against her side, too young to understand. She whispered apologies, her voice cracking as she admitted she had been blinded by Damon's promises, too selfish to think of anyone else. But Grace didn't move to comfort her. She stood still, her face calm, her heart steady. She had waited years for this moment, not to see her sister suffer, but to finally face her without fear. Evelyn's tears did not erase the betrayal, nor did her apology erase the years Grace had spent rebuilding from ruins. The child looked up at Grace with wide eyes, and for a moment, Grace's chest ached. The child was innocent, but Evelyn's choices had brought her here. Grace couldn't allow her compassion for the little one to cloud the truth of what Evelyn had done. After a long silence, Grace stepped back slightly, her expression unmoved. She told Evelyn she couldn't undo what had happened, and she couldn't offer the safety Evelyn wanted. Her life had been rebuilt with effort and sacrifice, and she would not risk it by reopening a door that had been closed for good reason. Evelyn sobbed harder, but Grace remained firm. She wasn't cruel in her words, only distant. She had learned that protecting herself meant refusing to be pulled back into the chaos of those who once destroyed her. As the rain fell harder outside, Evelyn realized that Grace's strength was not born of revenge, but of survival. Evelyn left that night with tears on her face, but Grace didn't chase after her. She didn't slam the door, she didn't raise her voice, and she didn't throw bitter words at her sister. She simply chose distance. That choice was her strength. She knew she could never undo the betrayal, but she could refuse to let it poison the life she had built. Grace went back inside her apartment, the walls warm and bright around her. Every corner reminded her of how far she had come. Her own furniture bought with her earnings, her shelves lined with books she had studied, her desk stacked with plans for future investment. It was not a mansion, but it was a home built on her own effort, steady and honest. Evelyn had seen it with her own eyes, and Grace knew that image would stay with her. The sister she once replaced at the altar had risen higher than either she or Damon could ever reach. Time passed, and Damon eventually found a way to reach out. He sent a letter through a distant cousin, writing about regrets and mistakes. He spoke of missing what they once had, and hinted at wanting reconciliation. The words were polished, carefully chosen, as though he believed he could charm his way back into her good graces. Grace read the letter once, then folded it neatly and placed it back in the envelope. She didn't respond. There was nothing to say to a man who had discarded her in front of the world, only to return when his fortunes collapsed. His attempt at regret was nothing more than self-preservation, and she would not be used again. Evelyn tried once more too, visiting through relatives, hoping Grace's silence had softened. But every time, Grace stood her ground. She didn't argue or shout. She didn't seek revenge in harsh words. Instead, she let them both watch from a distance as she continued to grow, her career rising, her properties expanding, her life secure. That became her quiet revenge. Not revenge of cruelty or spite, but of success. While Damon and Evelyn carried the weight of their choices, Grace carried herself with dignity. They had torn her down once, expecting her to stay broken, but she had risen into someone neither of them could touch. The whispers reached them eventually. People spoke of Grace's independence, her respected work, and the comfort she had earned for herself. Damon's pride must have burned each time he heard her name spoken with admiration. Evelyn's guilt grew heavier when she realized her sister no longer needed her or wanted her near. Grace never gloated. She didn't spread stories or try to humiliate them the way they had humiliated. She didn't have to. Their downfall was written in the life they lived, unstable, lonely, filled with regret. Her triumph was written in the life she built, quiet, steady, and untouchable. She had learned that the best revenge was not anger, not bitterness, but peace. And in that peace, she found freedom they would never know. Years later, Grace stood by the window of her home, looking out at the quiet street below. The air was calm, and for the first time in a long time, her heart felt the same. Life had not gone the way she once dreamed, yet it had given her something she never expected, strength built from pain. She thought of Damon and Evelyn, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Their downfall had not been caused by her. They had destroyed themselves long before they tried to destroy her. Lies had been the foundation of their choices, and lies never held. What collapsed around them was the weight of their own decisions. Grace had no part in it, except to step aside and allow the truth to take its course. Her parents sometimes still mentioned Evelyn, speaking softly about struggles she faced. Grace listened, but no anger rose in her anymore. She had stopped carrying the burden of their choices. The bond that had been broken could not be repaired, but it no longer haunted her. She had her own life, one untouched by their chaos. Work filled her days, and success followed her steady efforts. She didn't flaunt it, yet those who knew her saw the dignity in the way she carried herself. Friends admired her calmness, her discipline, her ability to rise without stepping on anyone else. They didn't know the whole story, but they could see the strength in her, the kind that could only come from surviving something deep. One night, as she sat alone on her porch, the memories returned again. She saw herself in her wedding dress, Damon's hands pushing her away, Evelyn sitting silent with guilt written across her face. For years, that scene had been a wound she carried everywhere. But now, as she thought of it, she felt no sting. She whispered softly to herself, "They pushed me aside for a lie. But the truth is they freed me." It was the freedom that mattered most. Freedom from false promises, from family who didn't stand for her, from a life built on deception. That day had been the end of one story, but it was also the beginning of a new one she had written with her own hand. A story of survival, growth, and quiet triumph. Grace stood and walked back inside, the rooms filled with the warmth of the life she created. Every wall, every corner was hers, not borrowed, not dependent, not tied to anyone else's name. She had built a future Damon and Evelyn could never touch, and she carried it with pride. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman no longer broken, but whole. Dignity rested in her posture, peace in her eyes. The past would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had turned betrayal into strength and pain into freedom. And as she closed the door behind her, Grace knew her story had finally reached its end, not with revenge, but with peace.